In this week's video, I decided that we're going to take a little break from painting and instead we're going to do a nice simple drawing. And if this drawing looks difficult to you, I want you to know that it's a lot easier to draw than you might think. And like always, I'm going to show you every single technique that I use to draw this one. No airbrush or paints this week. I'm only using graphite pencils 6B to 4H. The two brands of graphite pencils that I'm using are Staedtler and Tombow. And then for blending the graphite on the paper, I'll be using a few different tools, a few blending stumps and cotton swabs, which are Q-tips. For the highlights, I'll be using a few different types of erasers, and I will be talking about them throughout this video. If you want to draw this one along with me, up on the screen now is a high-res photo of my completed drawing, and of course I will include the photo that I took for this one and the gridded version up on the members page this weekend. I have a crop section of my completed drawing on the left side of the screen so you can see what we're drawing towards here. I sketched out all my initial lines with a light pencil, a 2H, and the surface that I'm working on here is actually an illustration board. It's a Strathmore 500 series illustration board, a very smooth, strong surface to work on. So what I'm doing here is adding a base layer of this graphite into this top petal. If you look at my completed drawing on the left side of the screen, I'm working on this area that I'm circling. It's kind of similar to a hatching technique where you draw in a bunch of parallel lines. But for this technique, I'm not lifting up the pencil, just very large oval shapes that overlap, trying to get an even layer of this graphite down onto that paper. And you probably noticed here that I'm holding the pencil at the very back of it. This way, I don't apply too much pressure because a 4H or a 6H pencil is very hard. And if you apply too much pressure with it, you could easily damage or dent the paper. So you need to be careful with the harder pencils. But a great thing about the harder pencils is that it allows you to apply a very light layer, a light value of the graphite. And so at this point, once I get that graphite down, I like to blend it out. This way I get rid of any of the pencil marks. It just looks like a smooth transition in here. For this part, because it's a bit of a larger area, I'm going to use a Q-tip here. And what I'm going to do is start right in the center and then start blending the graphite in small circular motions. Now, if you're just starting out, you're getting into drawing or painting, just remember that there's many ways to go about doing this. I like to blend the graphite on the surface using a bunch of different tools like the Q-tip that I'm using here. But again, there's plenty of ways to go about drawing, applying values without blending the graphite. So as we continue, just understand that the approach that I'm using here is one of many, many ways to go about doing this. Another tool that you'll see me using a lot in drawing is a blending stump like this one here. You can get these anywhere. They're very cheap. It's basically a piece of paper, kind of like newsprint, rolled up very tightly, so it's almost like a pencil. And they come to a sharp point at the end, so you can get in there and blend some very small areas to get those very subtle transitions and gradients. If you look at my completed drawing, you'll notice that the darkest values on this petal are at the top and along the bottom. So I'll come back in with a 2H pencil and add a bit of this graphite along the top just to help darken it up. And then to blend that graphite in, I switch back over to that blending stump and start at the top where it's going to be darkest. And when I blend it, I like to use small circular motions, just starting in the darkest area, applying more pressure there. And then as I move into the lighter area, into that transition point, I'm using less pressure on that blending stump. And as long as you take your time with this, you can pull off some very smooth transitions. I'll switch back to that 2H pencil and then I'll add some of this graphite along the bottom where it's going to be a bit darker as well. And then once I add the graphite down, I always go right back over to some type of blending tool just to remove any of those pencil marks, any of those small lines that you get from drawing it in. Now I want to add some darker value here, so I'm switching to a darker pencil. I'm using an HB here. And I'm doing the exact same thing that I did before, just adding some of this pencil along the bottom and along the top where it's a bit darker, and then blending those transitions in to get that subtle gradient, just that shift from dark to light back to dark again. For a few of the highlights, I'm going to switch over to an eraser. Now this is the Faber-Castell 7056, which is a softer eraser. It works very well for graphite, lifts it right up. And I'm coming into this area on the left side that has a bit of a highlight in it, and I'm just sketching in a few lines parallel to each other. This is essentially a hatching technique, but one thing that I'm trying to do is I'm not trying to press too hard into that paper. I just want to lift a small amount of this graphite up. Once I removed enough graphite, I'll come back in with that blending stump, blend the surrounding area in, and then I'm going to go right back over to the pencil and darken up the values again. So you can see the steps that I'm using here to build up the value. I'm just going slowly, adding some of the graphite, blending it, and then adding some more. And this process is very, very similar to the techniques that I use in airbrush painting. I always want to slowly build up to the dark values. The reason for that is just because it makes it so much more forgiving. When mistakes come up, which they eventually will, it's much easier to remove a small amount of graphite than a lot. And so even at this point, if I don't like how this one petal came out, I could erase all of it and start again. For a darker value, I'll come in with a 2B pencil along the top here and just lightly apply some more of this and then blend it right back into the surrounding texture. When working with a blending stump, you'll notice that the tip of it will start to dull after about 20 to 30 minutes of use. So what I like to do is just use a sandpaper block like I'm showing here and just run that blending stump over it. This way I could sharpen the edge up again and bring it to a pretty sharp point. This will also remove all of that graphite on the blending stump. So if you have some darker like 2B or 4B graphite on it, run it over this and then you could use it in the lighter areas again. I'll jump down to this smaller petal on the lower left-hand side of the drawing and start adding graphite in. Now you'll notice here that this one's a little bit darker, so I started with the 2H pencil and I just applied a little bit more pressure. If you just look at this one petal and ignore everything else in the drawing, you'll notice that the value is a little bit darker on the top, it gets lighter in the center, and then it gets dark again. There's like a bit of a petal there underneath. So for that area that's brighter, I'm using a kneaded eraser here, and you can see that I just kind of shaped it so that it has a sharper point at the end. And what I'm doing is just touching this into that area that's a bit brighter to pull out some of that highlight. This is just going to remove a small amount of graphite, so it's a great way to get a subtle highlight into any part of the drawing without adding too much texture to it. And if some of the graphite got where I didn't want it to be, I'll use this small Tombow eraser. I showed this on the channel a few weeks ago, and I could just come in and clean up, sharpen up that edge. Moving along to this larger petal right in the center, it's a bit darker on the left side, so again, I'm going to start with a 2H pencil. And once I have a few of those values blended out, it allows me to see the petal that I just worked on before a little bit differently. Now that the area to the right side of it is a bit darker, I noticed that this left side was a bit too light, so I need to darken it up. For drawing, in most cases, you're going to be working on a white piece of paper. And it's important to understand that the way you see and perceive values is always going to be influenced by the surrounding values. So as I added in some of the graphite to the right, it allowed me to see the area that I just worked on, this smaller petal, a bit differently, and it made me notice that it was too light. So I'm just going over it again with an HB pencil, just applying some more graphite into that area and blending it smooth with that blending stump. And the reason that I'm telling you this is that throughout any drawing that I'm working on, I always go back to an area that I worked on earlier, because as I get further into the drawing, more of the white paper is going to get covered with graphite, so the surrounding areas, meaning the areas that I worked on earlier, are going to look a little bit different. And that's also one of the reasons why I like to start with lighter values and slowly build up to those darker values, because it's so much easier to add a bit more graphite to darken up an area than it is to use erasers and kneaded erasers to lighten up areas. As I move up along this petal, I'll add some graphite with an H pencil along the contour, just along that edge. And then I'll use that blending stump to start pulling some of that graphite, blending it from this darker area on the left side to the lighter area on the right. What I'm essentially doing here is using my blending stump just to steal a little bit of graphite from that left side and start pulling it over to the right side. And as I move into this highlight, I use less pressure on that blending stump so it applies less graphite, giving you a lighter value. I'll slow the video back down to real-time speed here so you can get a better sense of what I'm doing. I added a bit more graphite along that contour with a 2B pencil, so it's a bit darker. Now you can see that I'm coming in with a blending stump and again, using those small circular motions, applying more pressure where it's darker and then slowly easing up, using less pressure as I move into the highlight. That gives us a gradient, a transition from dark to light. And those gradients, those transitions of values are everything in this style of drawing. Those values are responsible for all the illusions that we're getting within this drawing. Any area that's brighter is going to make it look like it's closer to the light source, and any area that's darker looks like it's moving or rounding away from it. As I added some more values along the center of this rose, I noticed that the first petal that we started with was still too light. This is just what I talked about a few minutes ago. Since we have more values in here, I'm seeing the area that I worked on before differently. So to darken it up, I'm coming in with an HB pencil and a 2B pencil, adding a bit more graphite and then blending it out. Within the center of this rose, there's a bright highlight, but it's not pure white. There's a bit of value in there. And adding a flat, even value with a pencil can actually be a pretty difficult thing to do. So what I like to do is start with a light pencil. I'm starting with a 4H here, and you can see that I'm holding it at the very, very back of the pencil. This way I'm applying a very light amount of pressure, and I'm just adding in a bunch of horizontal lines. This is called hatching. And you can see that I'm overlapping the strokes, making a few different passes over this area to help build up an even value of that graphite. And then I'll come back in with a blending stump and do the exact same motion, just some horizontal lines over the top of this. I can also add a little bit of texture within this area by using different pressures on that blending stump. The right side of this petal is going to have some darker values, so I'm going to come in with an HB and a 2B pencil, just add that down, and again, start blending it over to the left. For this larger petal at the bottom, you can see that it's a lot darker, so I'm going to start here with an HB pencil and add some graphite toward the top. Once that's blended in, I'll use the HB pencil again on the lower part of this petal and then just start blending those two together. This way we'll get those darker values between the top and the bottom and a bit of a lighter area in the center. And I'll just continue layering that graphite, building it up, getting darker and darker. For the cast shadow just below the rose, I'm using a 2B pencil and I'm applying a fair amount of pressure. You can see how much darker I'm able to get that value. And now because that dark value is in, I can see the value just above it a little bit differently. I realize it needs to be darker, so I just added some more graphite into that petal. And now I'm going to continue with this 2B pencil, working my way down, sketching in the shape of this cast shadow. Because I want this area smooth and a very dark value, I want to make sure that I build up the graphite slowly. Starting with that 2B pencil, once I get an even layer of that graphite down, I blend it, kind of burnish it into the surface using a blending stump and a Q-tip. And I'll do a few layers of the 2B before moving up to a 4B pencil, and then just continuing the same process. I'll use a Q-tip or a cotton swab along the lower edge of it just to get that very smooth transition where the shadow just kind of fades into the white background. And if you're just getting into drawing or painting, I just want to remind you that it's very important to work slowly. Most of this video is sped up, so it just gives the illusion that I'm working a lot faster than I actually am. I'm not at all. I'm a slow drawer. I'm a slow painter. I always take my time. And as I'm doing this, I'm just paying attention to values. I'm trying to notice where I see lights and darks and the transitions between them. As I move along to the stem here, you'll notice that along the bottom, there's a very dark shadow. So I used a 2B pencil to draw that in, a bit of blending with a blending stump. And then I used a 2H pencil to add that lighter value along the top part of that stem, and then erased out that very thin bright highlight right along the center of it. And so to finish up this little drawing video, we'll just paint in this one leaf and then wrap this up. You can see that this leaf is a much darker value than the rose itself, so I'm starting here with the 2B pencil. I'm using the exact same techniques that I used on the rose itself, except this time I'm using a bit more pressure on the pencils, and I'm also using some darker pencils. I'm using the 2Bs and the 4Bs. You may notice that when you add down some darker values with like a 2B or a 4B right on the white surface, that you're going to get some texture. Some of that paper texture is going to show through. So what I always do is I use a blending stump and really press down on it. This way you kind of burnish the graphite into the paper and it fills in all those little gaps. As I move along to the tip and the right side of this leaf, the value is going to be lighter. So I'm using a lighter pencil. I'm using an HB, adding some graphite down, and then just trying to blend that into the darker values that we added before. Those transitions and gradients are going to pull off the illusion, so it makes it look like this leaf has some depth to it. It looks like some areas of it are sticking up and some areas, some parts of it are just kind of rolling, rounding away from us. For the right side of this leaf, I'll start by adding in the cast shadow first with the 2B pencil and then blending it smooth, then using an HB to add an even layer of graphite across the right side of it, and then blend it out. This way we get a nice smooth transition in there of a pretty even value of graphite. Some areas in this are going to need to be a bit darker. So again, just another layer of graphite on top, a bit more pressure with that blending stump, and I can get those transitions in. So I do hope that this little drawing tutorial may be helpful to some of you out there. I promise that this is not a difficult drawing at all. Anybody could do this. It's just about taking your time, learning not to rush. And before I go, I want to say thank you so much for the very, very generous support of the channel members who really help keep this channel going. I'd like to welcome Alexander this week, and I'd also like to welcome back Takuji and Shallywood Arts. Thank you guys so much and welcome back. I hope everyone is having a great day. I wish you all the best in your drawings and paintings, and I'll see you back here next Friday.